Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
It's clear that we are reaching a time of instability, of imbalances.
We put a very big tariff on India, 50% tariff, very high tariff.
Because the work we do together is indispensable to a peaceful, stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific.
Good evening and welcome to the Australian Indian Institute's webinar on what to expect when you're expecting uncertainty, the Indo-Pacific in 2026. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to the elders past and present. In 2026, uncertainty is no longer a temporary condition of the Indo-Pacific, certainly not of its strategic environment. It is now its defining feature. And at the heart of this sort of uncertainty lies this heated rivalry between the United States and China. This competition, or this rivalry, is shaping the strategic landscape from the Pacific Islands to the Indian Ocean. This rivalry now impacts the strategic choices of every Indo-Pacific state. The United States remains the region's strongest military power, but its political signals are inconsistent. China is more assertive, more capable, and increasingly willing to test its own limits. Southeast Asia feels this uncertainty most acutely. ASEAN states are undergoing pressure to choose between security and prosperity between the United States and China, even as they try to avoid doing so. The result is strategic hedging, fragmentation, and a more fragile regional order where neutrality is harder to sustain. Further west, uncertainty is expanding into the Indian Ocean. India is rising as a strategic power, strengthening its partnerships with groups like Quad, while guarding its autonomy and managing tensions with China. And at the same time, China is expanding its presence in the Indian Ocean through ports, naval deployments, and infrastructure projects. It is transforming the region into a new theater of competition. The Indian Ocean is no longer peripheral, it is central to the Indo-Pacific stability. Together, these dynamics mean that the Indo-Pacific in 2026 is defined less by balance and more by flux. The key challenge for the region and for the regional states is not to eliminate this uncertainty, but really to manage it and deal with it. They can do this by building flexible partnerships, strengthening resilience, and by keeping their strategic options open. So really, this webinar is about understanding how this rivalry is making strategic discomfort permanent and not a temporary sort of issue, especially for middle powers, and how this fragmentation is really affecting the region. To discuss this sort of crystal ball gazing we're trying to attempt in this webinar, we've got a fantastic panel of next generation think tankers and policy and data researchers. I won't go into sort of extreme detail about them because I think most of you know them, but I'll give a quick sort of intro. We've got Tom Corbin, who's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy and Defense Program at United States Study Center. We've got Jack Sato he's a data analyst at the Lowy Institute when he works on their flagship program, the Asia Power Index. We've got Rushali Saha, who is a Maitree Fellow based at the United States Study Center. And finally, we've got Dr. Big Tran, who is a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, and a non-resident senior fellow with Verve Research. Thank you to all my panelists and welcome to our first webinar of 2026. I won't beat around the bush and I will sort of not to sort of talk about the elephant in the room will be a massive missed opportunity. So I'll just start with you, Tom. Can you give us a lowdown on the US National Defense Strategy that's just been dropped this week, and what does it say about US alliances and its strategic prioritization of the Indo-Pacific?
Thanks, Tista. No small task to get going with. Look, there's lots in the NDS that I could unpack depending on which way we wanted to take the conversation. But seeing as the purpose of this webinar is to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and you've asked me about alliances, perhaps I'll kind of go in that direction, and we can pull on some other threads later if that's useful. I mean, my general impression reading the NDS and then kind of reflecting on some of the commentary that's been put out so far as it pertains to the Indo-Pacific is there's maybe more in there for allies to like than initially meets the eye, both for reasons of continuity and change in US policy. And I'll try and explain where those points of continuity and change are. But generally speaking, I think when this audience is doing its own read of that strategic document, I think there are at least 3, perhaps 5 keywords you should keep in mind when you're reading through it. The first is prioritization. What regions of the world is the US looking to prioritize? What tools of statecraft is it looking to prioritize in addressing those challenges in different parts of the world? Scarcity. So this idea that the US can't do everything everywhere all at once, to use a popular movie title, when it comes to global security as it once did. And then the other one I'd say is shifting. That's mainly been with respect to the way that this administration has sought to cast its alliance systems globally, not just in Asia. But Asia is not exempt from that general trend, away from kind of a more polite model of burden sharing, if you want to put it that way, towards a clearer set of demands from this administration of its allies to assume more responsibility for both their own security requirements, but also for collective security goods, in which the US will continue to participate and contribute, but will no longer continue to be the out and out kind of burden carrier in that respect. And that's why I think you've seen terms such as burden shifting and even burden owning. If you go back and read some of the MAGA intellectual thinking around this concept, it's not just a matter of shifting burdens, it's a matter of allies owning those burdens. And I think that's more obvious in other parts of the world rather than Asia. I think the other thing that stands out for me reading the NDS is this emphasis on a balance of power. And that's important, I think, for Australia, my country, but also for other countries who have kind of seen this goal of a favorable balance of power as the guiding star, I suppose, for their own strategies for the last 7 or 8 years, I would say. The fact that this administration refers to achieving a favorable balance of power and an acceptable peace, I think is the way that it's framed in the document. That's actually quite consistent with the way that Australian and Japanese strategic documents, at least, have presented their own views of the regional balance of power, i.e. that the era of US dominance is gone, and that it's incumbent on those countries, Australia, Japan, but also other countries in Southeast Asia, India, South Korea, what have you, to kind of step up and play a larger role in contributing to collective security goods in the region as well. But the goal is not to shore up US primacy, it's to create a balance of power where there is no dominant single power who is the hegemon of the region. And that's quite clearly stated in this NDS. So I think if you're a policymaker sitting in Canberra or Tokyo, at least, you would be quite happy to see your own words kind of reflected back at you in this administration's strategic document. And I think it should also put to bed some of the more shrill assessments I've seen in the last couple of years that Australian, Japanese, or broader allied support for US military presence in Asia is somehow, indicative of our country signing up to preserve US primacy or dominance. Like, that era is gone. Allies have known that for a long time, and I think this is the first time we've seen a US administration really say that clearly itself. The other thing that really struck me was that, there's quite a lot of space for China in this strategy. It's interesting to me that the first island chain, so the strip of islands between kind of the Philippines and South Korea, including Taiwan and Japan, is the focal point for US military strategy. It has been for a long time, but I would say that this national defense strategy makes that quite crystal clear, that geographic region, rather than just Taiwan or any one country, is kind of the focal point for military strategy, that being a strategy of denial. But I think the NDS also kind of situates military strategy in a way alongside other tools of statecraft, so diplomacy and particularly economics when it comes to China, as part of I'm not going to say balanced approach, because I don't think that's what this administration goes for, and I don't think you can reasonably characterize anything this administration does as balanced. But I think it reads quite differently to other parts of the world, where I think you've seen the Trump administration view military power as a tool of first resort, or at least near resort. And I'm thinking here of Venezuela. I'm thinking of what's happening in the Middle East. And the way the document talks about those regions of the world where military power is a much more prevalent tool of US statecraft. I don't think it's framed in quite the same way in Asia. And I think the implication, therefore, is that the administration wants to keep, or wants to create, the conditions where it can have a constructive relationship with China, primarily on economics. And so I think that's why you've seen this kind of the talk of the strategy of denial and the first island chain. It's pretty heavily balanced, if not outbalanced, by the emphasis on kind of responsible diplomacy, open lines of communication, the concept of the strategic balance that I mentioned before. Like the implicit kind of finding there is that this administration is at least saying that it sees kind of China having legitimate interests or a place in the regional order in a way that hasn't really struck me in previous strategic documents to date. The question is, what kind of role is that? And that's why I think there are some pretty hefty question marks over the strategy, because it doesn't really say what role it sees for China. And by extension, it doesn't actually really say what the administration exactly wants to achieve with everything that I've just talked about. The strategy document, maybe I'll wrap up with this. The strategy document says a lot of the right things, at least as far as kind of strategic policy thinkers in this region would view it, or at least most of those that I talk to. But the kind of the ends, ways, and means of the strategy, if you will, don't receive equal attention in this document. And it's important to bear in mind here that this is a public unclassified version of the document, and you would hope that in the classified version that's being shared internally and with Congress, that there's more information on this stuff. But I think that was the last thing that was striking to me, that in the public version, the connection between the ends, ways, and means wasn't perhaps as strong as previous documents had been either.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very perfect sort of Cliff Notes TLDR version of a substantive document that you've done a fantastic reading of. Thanks, Tom. I'll take Tom's point on sort of what is China really doing and what is its role in the region. I'll take it to Jack. Jack, you work substantively as a data analyst on sort of the Asia Power Index that measures power in the Indo-Pacific. What are sort of the emerging trends in the US-China rivalry? Is it really a heated one, or what is happening?
Thank you, T-Star, and thank you, Tom. I guess since the first edition of the Asia Power Index in 2018, one of the most consistent theme is that very little has changed. China and the US are still both comfortably the biggest powers in the region. Although there have been small things. So in 2025, the previous edition, I think there was an expectation that the United States would drop a lot, especially with the chaos and uncertainty brought in with Donald Trump. In diplomatic influence, there were diminished perceptions on the US's foreign policy role. And the survey went out right after the tariffs were put in place. However, outside of that, there was very little change. And in a way, the United States is so big and so influential that no individual can disrupt that. For China, it's somewhat similar, where it's remaining the same. Since 2024, they've increased each year, although it's still below their pre-COVID score. However, one big trend is in their military capability. In the first edition in 2018, the United States was 28 points ahead of China in their military strength. In the previous edition, it was only 18 points. So it's kind of carved away that main score. And as I previously mentioned with the United States struggles with diplomacy in the last edition, China has very much taken advantage of that. It's now seen as a more stable and reliable partner, and they received their highest ever score for diplomatic influence.
So China is definitely closing in. It's definitely US is still at the top, but the gap between them isn't as big as it used to be, right?
It's somewhat smaller, but they're both trajectory going the same way
Ah,
and much faster than the next biggest partners in India and Japan.
right. Perfect. So speaking of India, I'll get to Rushali. Within this sort of geostrategic competition, India finds itself in a very unique predicament, right? So, as the Asia Power Index, the latest one, has highlighted that India is now elevated as a major power. Jack, please correct me if I'm wrong. It's no longer a middle power. But it's not a superpower either. It's a middle power. Sorry, it's a major power. Within that, and what we saw happening last year with the border issues with Pakistan and Operation Sindoor that followed after, what is the fundamental sort of strategic challenge for India in 2026, and how does it sort of see itself, outside this continental versus maritime debate that we often see? How would you frame sort of India's strategic 2026 future?
Thank you so much, Thesa, for that question, and a very, very timely question, might I add. Now, 2025 was a fairly turbulent year for India. There was a lot happening, and while India US questions did dominate the headlines, a lot happened in its immediate neighborhood as well. But before I go into that, I think I'll tackle your question in terms of the continental versus maritime domain, which has been a persistent debate in Indian foreign policy for a long time. And history has shown that the majority of the debate was sort of focused on the continental threats that India faced from the two countries which it shares land borders with, which is Pakistan and China, with which it has a very historically disputed sort of relationship, especially concerning the land borders. So that has been the dominant mindset, due to which India, I believe, has not been able to fulfill its maritime potential or even look at its maritime geography from the position of looking at it as an opportunity. That, however, I think is changing a lot now, and there is growing awareness that this is where India's strengths lie, as well as its vulnerabilities. And I think the vulnerabilities came out most acutely with the 2008 terrorist attacks, which were carried out using the Arabian Sea sea lines. So yes, there is a growing appreciation and understanding that this region is somewhere where India needs to pay more attention to, and more importantly, one where it has the advantage of geography. So it has also made India sort of re-question its assumptions about naval dominance, and that has to do directly with increasing Chinese presence. So that, I think, is an important consideration behind a lot of Indian initiatives, starting with, of course, the Security and Growth for All in the region, SAGAR, which was announced in 2015, which has now been upgraded to Mahasagar, which is mutual and advanced, holistic growth for and security across regions. So across all of these themes, what we're seeing is India is embracing its maritime identity. It is investing more in relationships and partnerships to ensure security in its immediate Indian Ocean neighborhood and beyond. We're also looking at India taking on a more active role in the Pacific and in sort of the South China Sea with ASEAN. It is expanding its partnerships. But I think the challenge also is that it is facing increasing pressure to maintain its position of strategic autonomy and partnerships with all in a world where the United States is behaving in a manner which is a very with or without us approach, as I see it. So it is facing challenges there. And I think even like the sanctions announcement first on Russia, which did directly lead to India reducing its imports of Russian oil, and now a possible threat over sanctions over business ties with Iran, whatever that is supposed to mean, according to President Trump's Truth Social post. India has to sort of reconceive how it is looking at these partnerships, especially with sort of Washington's adversaries, if I can put it that way. But it is expanding its partnership. And of course, the India-EU FTA, which was just announced, shows that it is embracing multiple partnerships, and it will continue doing so in the future. But a lot will depend, as the theme of this webinar, about how it navigates this uncertainty. And I do see 2026 being the year where India will continue to assert its multiple partnerships, but it will become difficult. And there are some immediate questions that India needs to look at, especially in its immediate neighborhood, given the political upheaval that is happening. So it's a year of both sort of like opportunities and challenges. I hope that answers your question.
It does in every way. Thanks, Rushali. I think nowhere else really understands the conundrum that India is as much as perhaps Southeast Asia. And I'll come to you with the same sort of question that I did with Rushali in terms of how does the region, as complex, as diverse, and as vast as Southeast Asia, sort of deal with this, geostrategic rivalry? I talked about sort of hedging and fragmentation. What is the vibe for ASEAN in 2026? How is it looking to sort of face this year?
Yeah, thanks, Tista, for the question. So you pointed right there that ASEAN is so diverse. So there are a lot of different opinions within ASEAN. But again, one of the principles of ASEAN is consensus. So that make it very difficult to make any decision, right? And now ASEAN have to face both internal and external pressures. So the conflict in Myanmar is going on for years, and we still don't have a solution for that. And just to be clear, ASEAN won't interfere in members' domestic affairs because one of its key principle is non-interference, right? So if we put expectation too high on ASEAN, and of course we will feel disappointed on what it's doing regarding Myanmar issue. And then again, ASEAN did not prevent the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand from happening. But to actually, supporters of ASEAN still believe that ASEAN has some value to offer because in their view, it would have been worse without ASEAN. Because of ASEAN mechanisms, so Cambodia and Thailand still talking on other issues, on kind of areas where they can cooperate with. And, in terms of the South China Sea, from the very beginning, before even Vietnam decided to join ASEAN, it's already knew that non-claimant would not stand up against China to protect the interests of other claimants in ASEAN. If you want to know more about that process, I strongly recommend a book called Flying Flight, Vietnam's Decision to Join ASEAN by Nguyễn Vũ Tùng. So he examines, diplomatic cables. So very clear, Vietnam knew that from the beginning, but still decided to join ASEAN. Why? Because, before 2003, Vietnam used ASEAN as a kind of umbrella to engage with major powers. So why I mentioned 2003? Because Vietnam normalized relationship with the US in 1995, but before 2003, when Vietnam changed threat perception, Vietnam found it very difficult to reconcile, the normalization with the US and how to engage its former adversary. So ASEAN is very useful platform, right, to engage with not just United States, but also other major power as well. And then after 2003, so what happened in that year was that the Communist Party of Vietnam issued a resolution saying that Vietnam will, employ a strategy of cooperation and struggle. So basically, you cooperate where you can and struggle where you must. So because of that change in threat perception, after 2003, Vietnam feel more free to engage with the West. So after that, ASEAN still useful because it provides a platform for Vietnam to demonstrate leadership on the international arenas. And because of that, for Vietnam, ASEAN is always useful. And within ASEAN-led mechanism, the power of ASEAN has always been the convening power. So where, countries, like the US, Russia, China, even though they have differences, they still come under ASEAN-led mechanism to talk, to engage with the ASEAN, the Southeast Asia. Just to give you an example, 2 months ago, in the Philippines, the ASEAN Regional Forum organized a workshop on space security. And, there was a representative from the US, Russia, China, Cambodia, and Thailand, and many other countries. So all of them came there, and they didn't focus on, they didn't talk about Russia invasion of Ukraine, or they didn't talk about Cambodia and Thailand conflict. They talk about cooperation, in outer space. So that helped to show that with the convening power, ASEAN can bring powers and countries with conflicts. Still, they come and talk under that umbrella.
Thanks so much, Vic. It's not an easy sort of thing to put all of ASEAN and explain it in 5 minutes, and you've done a perfect job. So thank you so much for your answer. So I think what I get from all of the panelists is that, look, certainly the Indo-Pacific is looking for solutions in trying to understand where they fit in with sort of the geostrategic rivalry and the US and China having different strategic priorities. I want to ask a controversial question, though. Do we even matter? With everything that's happening with sort of Venezuela, the Israel sort of Palestine that's taking up a lot of sort of decision-making power in the US, Russia, Ukraine. I think I'll come to you, Tom, with this. In terms of strategic prioritization, is the Indo-Pacific lagging, or is it just something out of sight, out of mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not even sure prioritization is the right word to use when we're talking about Asia. I think it's a question of deprioritization of other parts of the world. And that is to say that overall, my sense so far is that where Asia ranks, like if you had kind of a ladder of regions of the world that the administration kind of shuffled around every time it reset its national defense or national strategic priorities, I actually don't think Asia was the thing that was moved. I think the things that were moved were the Western Hemisphere has gone up, obviously. It's now equated much more directly with US homeland security. Europe, if you read the NDS, is the only region of the world that the US has avowedly deprioritized. It's implied that the Middle East isn't going to matter as much for the US, but if you actually look at what's happening on the ground, you're seeing quite literally US military resources that are assigned to Asia being reassigned to the Middle East again. That's happened twice now in the last 12 months, and it's continuing a trend that I've certainly been tracking across administrations of both sides of the aisle for at least the last 10 years. So in that sense, I don't know. I don't think it's accurate to say that Asia's been deprioritized. I think it's also a reflection of the fact that in global terms, we enjoy a far greater degree of stability than a lot of other parts of the world right now. But I think it's also, and this is the last point I'll make, I think it's also reflective of the extent to which US foreign policy and US defense policy at the moment are driven by the White House and not necessarily by the State Department or the Pentagon. I think just to give you kind of a pithy example of what that looks like in the National Defense Strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was Trump's first National Defense Strategy, didn't mention the president's name at all. The 2022 National Defense Strategy, so Biden's National Defense Strategy, mentioned the president's name twice. The 2026 National Defense Strategy mentions Trump's name 47 times. That's, like simple word counts, like they don't tell you a lot strategically, but I think if you square that with a lot of other evidence that you're seeing like publicly, but also when you talk to people who are kind of in the US strategic policy circle, it becomes quite clear that it's the White House calling the shots on all of these things. And that's part of the reason why, to some extent, the strategy that's been laid out by the Pentagon, but also if you go and read the State Department's NSS implementation guidance, part of the reason those documents are so vague or so open-ended is to maximize flexibility for the president to pursue his prerogatives whenever and however he sees fit.
Right. I think it was Shakespeare who said, "What's in a name?" I think quite a lot, according to the latest NDS. Thanks, Tom. So I'll get to you, Jack, now. Given the fact that this is prioritization or deprioritization, what is then the trend with the middle powers? What are they doing? Do you see any kind of sort of interesting trends emerging for 2026? in how middle powers are sort of accelerating or de-accelerating their sort of diplomacy or their military or their economic sort of prowesses? Do you see any sort of trends there?
Thank you, Tista. So one trend that we've found over the past few years is that there has been an increase in defense engagement between the United States treaty allies with each other, even without the United States presence, in particular for Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. So, as an example, in 2022, Australia had in their joint trainings without the United States, they participated in 5 with Japan and 4 with the Philippines. Last year in 2025, Australia participated in 13 with Japan and 10 with the Philippines. So more than doubled in both cases. And that's traveled to other areas of defense. Say there's the recent reciprocal access agreement between the Philippines and Japan, the agreements for Australia and the Philippines to jointly build infrastructure, and also with the Philippines procuring new fighter jets from South Korea. And that's also extended to their cooperation with non-US treaty allies. And I think it somewhat suggests that they're trying to develop a more robust defense network with their other partners in the region. So if the US attention gets pulled back to the Middle East or Europe, or is focused in the Western Hemisphere, they'll be more secure.
It's almost counterintuitive in that sense then, Jack, that even without the US allies are still going strong with each other.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. I think within this, I'll come to you, Big. There's this fundamental kind of dichotomy with Southeast Asia or ASEAN is the ASEAN centrality, right? The idea and the concept of that sort of ASEAN centrality and its own version and outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Right? How do you see that sort of aligning with the visions that sort of Tom's talked about through the NDS or Jack's sort of data on the sort of the power balancing? How does ASEAN balance its sort of own balancing within what's happening in the sort of the wider region?
Yeah. So you mentioned ASEAN centrality, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So even that concept is still a lot of debate about what it actually means, right? My understanding is ASEAN centrality meaning about its convening power, which I already talked about earlier. But ASEAN, I think to cope with the current environment, I think ASEAN as a bloc doesn't have a kind of not a good example of how they deal with the uncertainty, right? But if you look at individual ASEAN members, then in order to deal with the uncertainty, the new world order, many of them have employed hedging strategy, not like recently, for the last 20 years. So actually, uncertainty for them has been the feature for the last few decades. Yeah, not a recent phenomena. And then how the way they employ hedging, because the goal is to mitigate risks, right? So there are many risks that they can try to mitigate, whether it's like rely on one single power or have to choose sides or facing withdrawal from the US. And then I think the key term for me is diversification. So diversify economics, diplomatics, and even military ties. So I think it's much easier to diversify diplomatic ties because you can just, be friends to everyone and you sign some kind of political statement saying that you become strategic partnership. You have a strategic partnership or even comprehensive strategic partnership with some country. So that's easy to do. The next level is diversify economic ties because it then involves actual trades, investments. So it's more difficult to do, but still you can implement that with a large number of countries. But diversifying military ties are much more challenging because when you diversify your arms supplies, right, it creates kind of problem between different equipments or system. So that's why countries like Vietnam have talked about diversifying arms supplies for many, many years, even before 2014, when Russia kind of annexed Crimea, right? And then facing sanctions from the West, making it more difficult for Vietnam to buy arms. But not until recently that Vietnam kind of like really active in that domain. But it's still difficult. I think what they are doing now is to have kind of defense dialogues and then trainings. But in terms of equipment and weapons, it's still a very a big challenge to diversify. And then, for other countries like Singapore, for example, right? I think that even though they keep saying that Singapore supports multilateralism, but I think deep down they are very skeptical. So recently, Singaporean Prime Minister promote a concept called flexible multilateralism. So what it means actually on the surface, it looks exactly like minilateralism. So basically, you have a group of like-minded countries working on some issue, try to achieve kind of more concrete results. But in order to save face for multilateralism, Singapore just say that add the word flexible, meaning they welcome any country to join, right? But on the surface, it's just unilateralism. Yeah.
We're definitely seeing a lot of these new terms coming together. My favorite, though, as an Australian, is strategic equilibrium, because it's the perfect match of meaning balance of power with sort of strategic interests. And something that I think is a future research opportunity for those students who are listening in who study international relations is trying to sort of define what strategic anything is. What is it? Can you just add the word strategic in front of any word and then it just becomes a concept? But that's just the IR nerd in me coming out. So, Roshali, coming to you, I wanted to mirror what I asked Bic about sort of regional sort of understandings of collective security, right? So obviously Bic talked about ASEAN, which is it's been a long-standing sort of collective union, as opposed to sort of the Indian Ocean region, which of course has the SAARC, but its sort of historic togetherness we'll take another webinar. But really sort of, I wanted to ask you about, how does the Indian Ocean region view this new sort of uncertainty or not so new uncertainty? And what are its own sort of hedging or not hedging sort of strategies, really?
Right. So, I mean, firstly, of course, the Indian Ocean is too vast a region, but if I narrow it down to sort of South Asia and look at how India is approaching this question, we're witnessing India's attitude towards partnership in this region specifically changing. It's important to keep in mind that the South Asia region specifically is somewhere where India has been hesitant to enter into partnerships with what it views as sort of extra regional powers. And this is the region where its immediate security interests lie as well. And it is the region of its immediate influence, its sphere of influence. But having said that, I do see India taking on more a positive approach towards partnerships, which comes from a very pragmatic assessment that India alone cannot unilaterally ensure security for such a vast region. And that also explains why India is redefining its role from being the net security provider of this region to the preferred security partner. And in multiple speeches as well, the concept of partnerships is constantly sort of reiterated. And because India does not produce formal strategic documents, these speeches do become a very important platform to convey its foreign policy outlook. So I do see India embracing partnerships and minilaterals much more openly. While India has been a part of minilaterals in the past as well, dating back to BRICS from the early 2000s, it is taking on a more active role in through these partnerships because, as Dr. Tran pointed out, the flexible nature of it, the issue-based aspect of it, it fits very well with India's own thinking towards, well, strategic autonomy, I think. And going on from your advice, yes, let's look at India as the example where we have been advocating for sort of like this strategic autonomy for a very long time now. That is the founding sort of principle, so to speak, when India looks at partnerships in this region. So yes, India's attitude towards this has changed, and especially I think when it comes to a platform like Quad. We've seen India's attitude change a lot, which was a major driver in its revival again in 2017. But having said that, the fundamental nature of these partnerships is that it does not compromise on its ability to engage with other partners. The flexibility of it is very important. And for the Indian Ocean specifically, like even beyond SAARC, if we look at IORA, which is the only pan-Indian ocean organization, it does suffer from challenges because of lack of funding, because of lack of political will from its members. So at the multilateral level, there are challenges there. And that is sort of where this minilateral issue-based frameworks come in, which is why the Australia, India, France trilateral emerged, the Australia, India, Indonesia trilateral emerged as well. And there are these are becoming avenues for countries to sort of share their interests, to share focus, to devote resources to address the many challenges that are emerging in the region. How they evolve will, of course, depend on a lot on how the bilateral equations amongst the countries are evolving and how much resources they're willing to devote. But yes, overall, I do see the rise of minilateralism in the Indian Ocean region becoming an emerging trend, and one that I do believe will positively contribute to security of the region.
Sorry, Rushali, our question and answers from the polls are blowing up only for you. And they're all really just asking this one question. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, really, but the general gist of the questions really is about how does India come out of this power dynamics? And Tom, I'll bring you in a second on this as well. Just on sort of power dynamics between sort of the India-US relationship. How does India see the US? And then after that, Tom, I'll come to you and ask you how US sees India, not to start any fist fights at work between you two. Really, it's just something that it's just popping off in the question and answer thing. So I just thought I'll ask you.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a very, very interesting question. But again, the thing is, the unpredictability that has come in India-US ties makes giving a definitive answer a little difficult. But what I will say is how I look at this is India-US ties is something that has evolved over 25 years now. It is something that has taken a lot of sustained political will. It has taken like multiple levels of interaction across just the State Department and the White House. These ties are bipartisan in nature, and there is a strong foundation. Having said that, I do see President Trump's moves threatening the relationship as it has evolved. And it has evolved largely because the US has been accommodative of many of India's sensitivities, especially when it comes to sensitive issues such as the dispute with Pakistan and the Kashmir issue. Therefore, I think things derailed mostly when President Trump came in and claimed ceasefire between these two countries, which India has very openly said that that wasn't the case and that it was bilaterally achieved. So yes, it is a very complicated time when India is facing 50% tariff, which is amongst the highest. And India's response to this, again, as I've highlighted previously as well, is to diversify. And even with the India-EU FTA, I do believe that the timing of it has to do, like while the negotiations were on for a very long time, the finalization of it has to do with sending a signal that India has multiple partners and it is open to engaging with multiple countries at a time when the United States may not be giving India that space, which to sort of like, work around issues. But again, I do see this partnership surviving this. I think India is waiting to see how it plays out for the rest of the current administration. But there are strong ties, and India and US just signed a defense cooperation agreement for 10 years. So I am hopeful overall. But we have to see what happens because, again, we cannot really predict how the future will look like with President Trump there. But I am overall hopeful. And I do see especially Sergio Gore's appointment as ambassador, who does have close ties with President Trump, as an overall positive thing for India-US relations. But time will tell.
Tom, is Rushali being too optimistic?
No, I mean, I don't think she's wrong. I would associate myself with pretty much everything she said. I guess I would just kind of, as someone who doesn't watch India all that closely on a day-to-day basis, but who has a general sense of where India has fit into US strategy in recent times up until this point. I think from my perspective, one of the things that's caused the biggest rupture in the US-India relationship at the moment, in recent weeks at least, has been the pressure that the Trump administration has put on New Delhi to reassess the energy that it buys from Russia in the context of the United States trying to put pressure on Moscow and on Kyiv to reach some sort of peace settlement because it's a presidential priority. the fact that India is buying energy supplies from Russia isn't new. I think we all know that. Under the last administration, under the Biden administration, it was a trade-off they were willing to make when it came to drawing India out into the wider Indo-Pacific as a strategic counterweight of some description to China's rising power, even if that was largely focused on the Indian Ocean rather than the Western Pacific. How that all shakes out after this, if anyone on this call or anyone in commentary says they know how it's going to pan out, then they don't know what they're talking about, really. But I wouldn't be surprised if the longer term strategic bet that the US has placed on India for the last, 10 to 20 years at least, I wouldn't be surprised if that endures kind of past this administration or even through this administration. And I would just kind of foot stomp Rishali's point about the major defense agreement that's been signed. You can have a tumultuous economic relationship and still have a productive defense relationship. And we shouldn't mistake the kind of the crisis that's occurring at the political level between India and the US right now for a lack of progress on the more substantive fronts, including on the defense front.
I think it's that really famous American saying that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think this relationship personifies that perfectly. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Rishali. I hope it's still civil at work tomorrow. Look, I think I wanted to sort of, in the final round of questions from me, I'd be really keen to ask you this one sort of out of the box question. Is what do you see as a red herring for 2026? So something that we've not talked about, something that hasn't been covered by sort of analysts, and just something that you know stays at the back of your mind and keeps you up at night, really. I think I'll start with Tom, and then we'll go Rishali, Beek, and then Jack.
Sure. I don't know. I suppose like red herring in the traditional meaning, like the thing that's like over egged, I think is the possibility of a Taiwan high-end conflict scenario. But in the way that you phrased the question, I think one flashpoint that probably doesn't get as much attention as it ought to is the disputed maritime zone between China and South Korea. I think in the last 5 years, certainly you've seen a very familiar pattern of China's land building or territorial reclamation sorts of activities that we've witnessed in the South China Sea over the last decade being replicated in different ways in the disputed zone in the Yellow Sea between the two countries. South Korea has pushed back, mostly privately, but it's becoming an increasingly public issue. And it's quite worrying to me that we are seeing that same pattern of behavior. Whether or not that escalates into some sort of confrontation, I'm not so worried about that. I guess I'm more worried about the kind of the incremental gains or the quote unquote salami slicing that people have used to refer to China's tactics in the South China Sea being replicated at the other end of the first island chain, as it were. And that's not to say, that's to say nothing of the additional complications that could be posed by North Korea in this equation as well. I'm not deeply familiar with this situation, but it's not uncommon for South Korea and North Korea to have competing claims over different parts of maritime territory. And if that applies in this case, where China is also trying to stake its own claim, then it only gets more money from there.
Got it. Thanks, Tom. Rishali, what's your take on your?
Not as interesting as Tom's, a little boring, if I might say, but I will take off from what Tom said, where I think a lot of the Indo-Pacific discourse very broadly, firstly, is very focused on the Pacific and talks about sort of the military threats, so to speak, but not as much attention is being paid to what is happening with the hybrid threats and how non-traditional security actors are increasingly getting access to emerging technologies, which is a very serious concern. And I think the attacks on ships in the Red Sea is just one example of that. And these kind of threats are something that do need to be monitored very closely, and they aren't paid as much attention, and they often get sort of undermined within the larger discourse of sort of great power competition, military access and military competition, and naval competition more broadly. But these threats are real, they're increasing, and more importantly, they are posing an existential threat to many of the smaller island countries and the smaller littoral countries in the region. So speaking from a maritime perspective, looking at how hybrid emerging threats, maritime cybersecurity threats, how these will play out in the future is something that I think requires attention, although it may not be as flashy, it may not be as headline grabbing, but they are very important, and they will have a fundamental impact on how security of this of the region is sort of plays out, because if shipping line disruptions take place, it is directly affecting the economic and national security of countries. So that is something that I think needs to be paid more attention towards.
Thanks, Roshali. Absolutely. I think Tom mentioned the NDS also covers more economics now than ever before. So I think we're going there, but not fast enough. Big, if you wanted to come in with yours.
Yeah, so I want to talk about cyber security and cyber attacks, especially on like power grid or water supply. And within the military transformation programs at ISIS, we also very interested in the space cyber nexus. So cyber attacks to satellites, because you know that we use satellites for a lot of functions these days, from the civilians to the military aspect. And within threats to cyber system, to space system, then cyber attacks actually the preferred method that country goes to, because it's very difficult to attribute.
Thanks, Big. Jack.
Oh, thank you. So my red herring is on Bougainville's independence. The plan or hope is that it will be on the 1st of September 2027. And I think a lot of the discourse around it will focus on whether it's possible or how it falls into US-China competition, but it distracts from a much more pressing matter in Bougainville, which is on the Panguna mine in the center of the island, which was the main site for the conflict in the 80s. So the president of the autonomous region wants to reopen the mine by June. The previous operators, Bougainville Copper Limited, wanted to cooperate with China, but late last year, the government made an agreement with an Indian company, Lloyds Metals, who offered them different incentives. The big risk currently is that there still hasn't been any consultation with the local landlords around the mine, which was the main cause for the conflict. And for India, or specifically the Indian companies, there's a risk of a reputational damage in the wider region, just because India has never had a big mining project in the Pacific, and if things go badly, it could damage the future.
Thanks, Jack. I don't think anyone has thought of that. Not on this panel, at least, including myself. And can I say, someone in the comments actually has just mentioned the fact that we haven't mentioned the Pacific. And I take that fault entirely on mine as panel designer, that it's about the Indo-Pacific, and I haven't actually got on a speaker from the Pacific. So Shubhamitra, I take that completely as my fault. But really, I think, Jack, that really fits into the wider conversation that we're also having about sort of everything just being seen through a US-China lens, right? And that kind of takes away from the nuance of the middle power sort of not just hedging, right, but agency that we often sort of miss. But really something, and obviously this is more of for students who want to really get into the field of international relations. This sort of question is aimed at Jack, but really feel free for anyone to answer. Do you think when we're studying the region, right, as analysts, as students, are there any limitations to how our methodologies work, right? So for example, you work on this massive data heavy project like the Asia Power Index. Are there limitations to numbers? Is there limitations to sort of constructing a methodology that is so sort of objective?
Thank you, Tista. I was a bit nervous at first when you asked about for students of IR, because I didn't do it. Yes, but specifically with data, the ideal is always to have primary data, but at an international setting, it's impossible. So you always need to be cautious, and there's several reasons. But I think the biggest issue with data is that it's difficult to check, and that means any mistakes or inaccuracies can travel up. A good example of this is in trade between two countries. While you would expect them to be identical, or at least close, sometimes you can get vastly different numbers. And then it's not necessarily that the countries are fudging the numbers, but it could be that something's being missed, or one person's under a bit of pressure and so slightly changes the number. There's even been times where I've seen press releases from the same department report two different numbers in two different languages. And I think it's important what the previous Premier of China, Li Keqiang, did, where he commented how he found GDP unreliable and preferred to focus on three indicators, which were the railway cargo, electricity consumption, and the disbursement of loans. And why it's always important to have a broader range of indicators, so you have a kind of a more robust understanding, so those issues have less of an impact.
Thanks, Jack. I think it's always good to keep in your back of your mind that everything that we say, while it can be measured, there are sort of limits to sort of having an objective take on who is more powerful and who isn't. I think as a final question, there's this sort of, there's this Mike Carney speech at Davos, really, and this is a question from Ujwal from the sort of the audience poll, really. There's this notion that, middle powers need to now step up. And anyone, Big, Rushali, Tom, Jack, feel free to take stage. Can middle powers shape a new rules-based order?
Big question, but I'll bite. I mean, I think they already are. It's not a question of whether we should, it's like how we should do it. I mean, I spent my opening remarks laying out kind of the contours of US strategy, what the United States is doing. And one of the premises of this conversation has been like, how should the region react to what's happening? And like, what is the region doing in response? Not all of the trends that we're seeing are new. And we shouldn't assume that countries are starting from a standing start. I mean, my speciality is US alliances, many of whom you would consider middle powers by whatever metric you choose to measure that by from the literature. They are taking actions to integrate more closely with the United States on things like defense cooperation, technology cooperation, economic coordination, what have you. But they're pursuing those measures not simply to support a long-term US presence in the region. They're doing it because it's a self-strengthening mechanism, but also because it is a way to shape great power behavior, kind of more directly in terms of being able to feed directly into US policymaking and policy preferences, but also kind of as a second order effect, contributing to shaping Chinese behavior through the US, almost as it were. I have less to say on the global or the regional institutional front. That's not really my area of expertise. But I think I would kind of broadly associate myself with the spirit of Carney's speech, that middle powers kind of have to see the writing on the wall if they haven't already. I think in Asia, it's a bit of a different story. I think a lot of countries here have seen the writing on the wall for a long time and have been taking steps along the lines that BIC actually suggested around diversification on kind of multiple different tools of statecraft. But that's where the trend is, and I think that's what countries need to keep doing. And I think Carney was right, kind of highlighting that at least.
Well, it's certainly Canada's year.
If I may just sort of like add on from what Tom said as well, I'll just take it a step further, where I even think like the smaller sort of littoral countries and island countries, they are playing an extremely important role in exactly doing this, shaping how the strategic competition is playing out. And especially if I'm looking at the Indian Ocean, which has been my area of research interest as well, there are debates around how much capacity they may have to sort of like play a decisive role, but there is no doubt that they are shaping it specifically through what what we discussed throughout this webinar is diversification of partnerships. And that, I think, will play an important role. So it's not just about the middle powers, but it's also, so what we're witnessing is truly a multipolar world order emerging, and countries will play an important role in this. And that is increasingly becoming a reality, definitely in the Indian Ocean as well.
Perfect. I'll take that as the final word, Roshali, that you've had. We've reached the end of time, unfortunately. I wish we could keep going. But really, I'd like to end with something I know some of you are interested in, which is zodiac signs. So 2026 is the year of the horse, according to the Chinese zodiac calendar. And that's really sort of, it's the metaphor is that the horse is fast moving, powerful, and it's sort of difficult to control. So I think 2026 fits the bill perfectly. And I think from our discussions, it's very clear that sort of strategic choices in the region will be about, finding balance and not necessarily sort of brute strength, which is basically how you ride a horse, really, right? So I think I won't bore you with any more horse metaphors, but I think we've established that uncertainty is here to stay, and we're going to have to create some sort of new rules. So with that, thank you so much, panelists, for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully we'll do this again next year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Tista. Thanks, everyone.